I think that we basically have a moment when we're discussing whether the existing system of global economic integration, where products are produced in supply chains across multiple countries, is going to be something we're going to preserve with all the efficiencies, all the benefits to consumers, all the increase in their purchasing power that it has brought, or whether we're going to try to turn the clock back to where it was before the Second World War. And if we turn it back, I think that's going to be enormously costly for the United States and for the world economy. I think people may not, just because there's always a clamor about something, appreciate just how sweeping the proposals the United States has made are. The United States has traditionally been the world's leading advocate of open markets, to keep our alliances together, to help the best American companies and workers be able to export, to help American consumers buy goods at low costs. We're talking now about the United States imposing by far the highest tariffs of any reasonable-sized economy in the world. We're talking about the United States having tariffs that are well above the level of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that made the Depression great. And markets are processing that, and they're seeing a big set of problems, a big set of reductions in economic activity ahead. And the stock market only measures a very small fraction of the losses to the economy from policies of this kind. There are also big losses to workers, to consumers, and that spread more broadly. So we're going to make very important choices in the weeks ahead. I hope we make them wisely, which will involve backing off of the policies that have been announced.
And that's what happened on Wednesday when President Trump announced a 90-day suspension of most of the tariffs, with the notable exception of China.
You referred to history a couple times before, the World War II, Smoot-Hawley back in 1930. Does history give us any guidance about where we might go? For example, Richard Nixon, when he was president, did take us off the gold standard, and there was a fairly abrupt change in global economics as a result of what President Nixon did. Have we had this sort of abrupt departure from what has been before in economic policy before?
This is a much more abrupt change than when Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard. Then there were 10% tariffs, and those were the policy. Now the 10% tariffs are treated as some kind of base. The efforts of the United States in the aftermath of what President Nixon did were to cooperate with other countries, not to coerce other countries. So I don't know that there really is a historical precedent for what's being done now. And markets are speaking with incredible clarity. Sometimes markets are hard to interpret, but this is not one of those times.
You have handled your fair share of crises, both at the Treasury Department as Secretary, but also in the White House during the great financial crisis. From your experience, if you were back in the White House or the Treasury Department, what would you be looking at as perhaps the next shoe to drop? What would you be most concerned about right now?
I would have one concern if I was in the White House or in the Treasury, and that was my boss, the President of the United States. The main shoe that will drop or will not drop is the next thing the President says and the next order that he gives. And so I would be telling his political advisors that this had nothing to do with what was being said in other countries. This had nothing important to do with business executives' actions in the United States, that if the president was on this course, there would not be confidence. And if the president signaled a willingness to adjust his course, there would be confidence. And so the sole preoccupation that I would have if I were in the government would be with what the president was saying. And frankly, as I've said before, David, there are a very limited number of issues, and it has to be immensely significant, that makes it the right and moral thing for a senior official to resign because he is not comfortable with the direction that the president is setting. And the president is entitled to have advisors who believe in his policies, and individuals are entitled to follow their conscience. And so there are moments when the right thing to do is for a senior official to resign. When Elliot Richardson resigned, when given what he found to be an unacceptable order from Richard Nixon, that was such an example. When Cyrus Vance resigned because he didn't support what the Carter administration was doing in Iran, that was an example. When a number of officials in President Clinton's administration were not able to support his welfare reform bill, they chose to resign. Frankly, if I were in an administration that were pursuing policies as dangerous as these, I would be thinking very carefully about whether I had the ability to influence policies in a positive direction, or whether the right thing for me to do was to resign.
So, Larry, you and I have talked in the past about the question whether, in fact, various people, entities will absorb the increased tariffs, so it won't actually, to a large degree, fall on the consumer. What do you make of the arguments that, producers, intermediaries may well absorb a lot of the pain?
I think they're unquestionably wrong. Economists have studied very carefully the experience of the previous Trump tariff increases. For example, they looked at washing machines that were tariffed versus dryers that were not tariffed. They used a variety of different methodologies. Essentially, all the studies concluded that prices go up with tariffs. I've had the opportunity now to speak with senior executives at a range of major retailers. That is certainly their view. I suspect when you start getting earnings calls and business leaders are asked, will they absorb tariffs? Will they be able to push tariffs back onto their suppliers? Or do they expect tariffs to raise consumer prices? I suspect they will acknowledge that the dominant effect will be on consumer prices. And the important thing for people to understand is that this moment is very different than the previous Trump tariff moment. It comes at a moment when we already have some inflation psychology. It comes at a moment when the economy is pretty close to full employment. And most importantly, these tariffs are more than 10 times as large as the tariffs that were put in place in 2018, and therefore there's far less room for them to be absorbed in the traditional margin of distributors or suppliers. So I think it's fundamentally dishonest to make any claim that these tariffs are going to do anything other than be passed on in the form of higher prices.